Tonight on Beyond the Darklands, one of Australia's most vicious serial rapists and murderers.
He's a man who has no conscience, no soul.
Peter Dupas was just a baby-faced 15-year-old schoolboy when his attacks against women began.
He was just so nice. He was polite, he was nice. Everybody thought he was lovely.
For over 30 years, Dupas wove a web of violence and brutality. He raped, mutilated, and ultimately killed.
He was trying with all his might to take my life.
Anybody can be a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Anybody.
Described as a monster, a creature of pure evil. Tonight, clinical psychologist Dr. Leah Giarratano tells how Peter Dupas came from beyond the Darklands.
Peter Dupas is a living, breathing nightmare, a serial sexual sadist, a lust murderer. He rapes and mutilates women, and he can't be cured. A man like Peter Dupas kills simply because murder sexually arouses him, and the amount of sexual fulfillment he gets depends upon the amount of torture he inflicts. Come with me now into the mind of a true psychopath.
Peter Norris Dupas's story begins in the middle-class suburbs of post-war Australia. The third child of older parents, he was born in Sydney on July the 3rd, 1953. When still a baby, Peter's family moved to Victoria.
It was a great family unit. They appeared to be certainly the mother and the father, for that matter. He was a hard-working man, and the mother was a very loving person.
Dupas's strict father, Norris, demanded perfection from his son, while his mother, Merle, was overprotective, almost smothering towards her youngest.
Peter was the pride of his mother. His mother just sort of had him up on a pedestal the whole time. She just thought Pete was just wonderful, you know.
He had a great deal of respect for his mother, and she likewise looked at Peter as her shining light.
From an early age, the one constant in Peter's life was his elderly parents. With mostly them for company, Dupas soon learned how to curry favour with adults.
Peter was always around. He used to walk me home at night and see me inside, make sure that I got inside all right at night.
By the early 1960s, the family had finally settled in Bradstreet Road, Mount Waverley, a quiet, leafy middle-class suburb to the east of Melbourne.
It was a fantastic era to grow up. There were lots of young families, lots of children around, lots of sporting activities. The school was only 5 minutes away. There were lots of parks and fields, and it was a great place to grow up.
By the time Peter was 12, his older siblings, Robert and Faye, had moved out of home, and Peter enrolled at Mount Waverley High School. He was a slow learner, repeating his first year.
Nobody ever paid any attention to him. And if he was absent or away or in the playground, you just never knew he existed. You know, he was just sitting in the room. He was very introverted and quiet, and we just never really took any notice of him.
Dupas's schoolmates considered him strange and unfriendly.
I feel that Peter was a very unhappy person. That's what I remember of Peter Dupas, a very unhappy person.
He was short, fat, and very plain, but he was very weak. And when I say weak, I mean physically weak and mentally weak.
He was called Pugsley because he was overweight, he was slow, and he looked like the little kid on the Addams Family. And he mustn't have liked that very much. But one day in particular, I remember he was teased, and someone had called him Pugsley. And at this particular time, maybe he just had a gutful of it, and he must have got angry. I just remember his face just changing, and to me, it just turned evil.
Peter didn't bond with his people of his own age, so he had no peer group situation, and he was sort of isolated.
My son did say that he had funny eyes. Something about his eyes that were a bit sort of scary, you know. He did have very dark eyes.
Most people, you can say, well, That's the pupil, and that's the colour of the eyes surrounding the pupil, but you can't see it. It's very difficult to detect in Peter's eyes. My son said, I don't know with Peter, but, he just felt uncomfortable around Peter at that time.
There's increasing evidence that biology can play a role in the creation of psychopaths. And there's a theory that sexual sadists are born with their neural pathways wired all wrong, so that when they become sexually aroused, their brains tell them to seek, to devour, to attack their prey.
Within a few short years of the Dupas family moving into Mount Waverley, strange rumours began to surface of underwear disappearing from clotheslines and menacing eyes peering at women.
The neighbourhood chat was the fact that there was a peeping Tom in our particular area, and we were all very vigilant and concerned.
Peter Dupas was 15 years old and showing the first signs of a confused and disturbing sexual profile. One November day in 1968, still dressed in his school uniform, he paid a visit to the young mother next door. She was home alone with her 5-week-old baby.
I went to the door and Peter was there. And he said, with a bit of urgency in his voice, he said, can you lend me a knife? Because I need to peel some potatoes. And well, dumb me, I didn't think twice about it. I went to the drawer and gave him one of those little sharp knives. And he took it, and within seconds, he came towards me. From then it was on. I mean, I ended up lying on the floor with him on top of me, and I was cut. My hands were cut because I was fighting to keep the knife away from me. Couldn't run away because my baby was there. I was grasping at straws saying, look, you need help. You need someone to help you. We'll help you. You'll be all right. And then he was mumbling, actually, and he says, I've got to finish it. I've got to finish it. That's what he was saying when I was trying to get control of him.
The frenzied attack was over as quickly as it had begun.
I survived, which was a miracle, because he was trying. He was trying with all his might to take my life. Simple as that.
It is a shock to hear that Peter Dupas carried out such a violent attack on his neighbour when he was only 15. But you see, he would have been having violent fantasies from as young as 5 or 6. He would have been planning his first rape as early as 10 or 12. Dupas is weak, so he's targeted a young woman with a baby, knowing she can't escape. But he's also fixated on mothers. He feels both disgust and intense sexual arousal for mothers, and for women of any age.
No one felt safe anymore in the leafy streets of Mount Waverley. And now that Dupas was aware of how powerful he felt with the knife in his hand, no one was safe. Peter Dupas's shocking criminal career began as a 15-year-old schoolboy, when in 1968 he violently attacked his next-door neighbour with her own kitchen knife. Dupas received 18 months probation for the attack and was also sent to the Larundel Psychiatric Hospital for observation.
When he was in Larundel, the reports of him there were he was the model child. So caring and friendly and lovely and helpful and everything, just perfect. But I've heard that he was very good at being like that.
He was released after just 2 weeks, with a psychiatrist noting Peter appeared to have been overprotected by his mother.
I spoke to Merle on the phone and she said, his mother, and she said, oh, Carol, she said it was just a brainstorm that Pete had. It was just a brainstorm, she said. And I thought, well, that's very strange, you know.
Yeah, it was unbelievable that he was back home so quickly. And I said to the police, why is this so? I mean, how do we know what he's going to do next? They said, we don't know.
No one could know what Dupas would do next, because his appetite to rape or kill would overcome him at any time. When his mother denies the seriousness of this attack, we have to wonder what else she might have missed in her son's upbringing. Failing to intervene when a child like Dupas exhibits bizarre or violent behaviour just reinforces that behaviour. The child sees it as normal, but no one else does. He's rejected, and that sends him back into his fantasy world where he feels powerful. And that's where he'll shape his next act of violence.
Peter Dupas was evolving into a strange and violent predator, a psychopath, and the peaceful community of Mount Waverley could never be quite the same again.
I think that just everybody was aware and very cautious.
It was a real shock to us, you know, a terrible shock, as it was to everybody, I think.
We moved out within weeks. We pretty quickly realised that there was no way we could stay there. Well, it was just not an option.
Dupas managed to hide his true self. His family threw a protective shroud over the disturbed teenager. His older brother Bob always looked out for him. And when he was 17, he left school and went to work with Bob as an apprentice fitter and turner at the local factory.
The impression that we got with Peter was that he was a good young kid. He was a very helpful young man. He had a baby face. People used to like him and mother him a little bit, if you like, the older women at the plant.
He was about 5'7". He was had droopy shoulders. He had blonde hair. He had a smile. He seemed happy enough.
Dupas worked hard to maintain this facade of normality, but cracks would soon begin to appear.
Peter had a girlfriend at the time, but I didn't know her. I even believe he may have even been engaged to her at one stage.
I think her name was Heather, and she was a nurse. When we had our Christmas dance, I think the first year that he was there, he walked in and his girlfriend had a couple of black eyes, and I didn't say nothing to him at the time, but the following Monday, he says, "Oh, Pete, you know, you shouldn't really hit your girlfriend." And that's when he turned around and belted me in the stomach. And I wasn't hurt, but I was quite surprised that he had the gumption to have a go at me.
Peter was living a double life and certainly fooling a lot of people.
You can't pick a psychopath by their appearance. They're successful in fooling people into thinking they're harmless because they usually look like everybody else. And psychopaths are experts at lying. For them, no one else matters, so they feel no anxiety when they're conning and manipulating you. They'll seem very convincing, and they quickly learn from you about your weaknesses. That's their whole focus upon meeting you. So they can easily lead double lives.
Dupas took refuge behind those he knew would protect him. Within this safe work environment, he began to meticulously plan a series of sexual attacks just 2 suburbs from his home.
I see him at his car, and I happened to walk up one day and I saw a Stanley knife, some tape and some cord sets in the back of his car, and I thought, why the hell would you want them sort of implements?
Dupas knew exactly what he wanted the implements for. Again, he targeted a young mother home alone with her baby.
He went to the door and knocked on the door and said that his car had broken down. He said, you know, could I use the phone? And then he said to this particular woman, oh, listen, if you've got a screwdriver, I should be able to fix it myself. And of course, while she went and got the screwdriver, he made entry into the house. And as she came back, he grabbed her around the throat and committed the offence.
Within days, Dupas tried to rape 2 other local women without success.
He knocked on the door saying his car had broken down, using exactly the same scenario.
By now, his car had been identified, but even so, his family still refused to face the truth.
We went around to Peter Dupas's house in Mount Waverley, and we knocked on the door, and of course we were greeted by his father. My recollection is that he went right out of his tree. He started ranting and raving at us, saying my son would do no wrong, and you know, he was terribly resistant to the fact that we were even there, let alone wanting to have us in any way, shape or form talk to his son.
And then they arrested Peter And that's when it all sort of, gee, nobody could believe it.
And we're all shocked. You know, we're flabbergasted. We didn't really think that he was capable of doing that.
It's now clear Dupas will never stop. He attacks 3 times in his own neighbourhood, increasing the risk he'll be caught. Although he was capable of carefully planning an assault, he would also pounce unexpectedly when the opportunity arose. But this could also indicate Dupas's low intelligence. Serial offenders with higher IQs tend to attack further from home to avoid detection.
He struck me as being a real baby-faced, pudgy little boy, if you like, and he virtually said nothing. He had his head hung, and I guess the most unusual thing to me was, and I would never forget his eyes, the way he looked. He was like a vacant stare at you when he looked at you, and those eyes to me were something I'd never encountered before. I got the feeling many times over during the interview that, okay, this guy is going to, looks as though he's going to admit something to us, and then it's as though something came over him and he just straightened himself up and just would say, I wasn't there, I deny everything.
In September 1974, 21-year-old Peter Dupas was convicted of rape and sentenced to 9 years. It was his first time behind bars. Dupas was beginning to discover his true self as his crimes were escalating. His polite manner had most people fooled, but there was one detective who could see the true monster within.
The cold, calculating way he went about it, the way he was in his demeanour during the interview, the way he went through the whole trial process and how he conducted himself, I thought to myself, this is a person capable of killing. And I wrote that at the time.
Unfortunately, he was right. Dupas was well on his way to becoming the killer he always wanted to be. In late 1973, a 20-year-old Peter Dupas attempted a series of sex attacks on young Melbourne mothers. He was jailed for the first time, receiving 9 years for the rape of one of the women. Jail was a place where Dupas's demons could hide.
To me, he looked like a person with significant psychological and psychiatric problems that may well have been too deeply set.
In 1979, Dupas left jail after serving the minimum term of 5 years.
I would have suspected that he would have been a model prisoner. I mean, he was a quiet person. He wasn't outgoing. He wasn't a person who'd rock the boat. He wasn't a person who'd cause trouble. And that he would have been released probably in the minimum period that he was required to be held.
26-year-old Dupas returned to live with his parents, who had begun a new life in Frankston on Victoria's Mornington Peninsula. After 5 years of being a passive, compliant prisoner, Dupas had an enormous amount of bottled-up frustration which he was ready to unleash. Within 2 months of his release, Dupas embarked on a 10-day reign of terror. He attacked 4 women. The first he raped in a public toilet block at Frankston. The other 3 escaped, but one, an elderly woman, was stabbed in the chest as she was trying to fight Dupas off.
Whatever may have happened in his past life, right from childhood, somehow he, I think, felt inadequate, made him feel inadequate. Rape is not about sex primarily, it's about power, humiliation, control, which at least momentarily probably made him feel powerful and in control and gave him some kind of a temporary thrill.
Although Dupas rapes compulsively, this doesn't mean he can't stop. He just doesn't want to. He's not insane. He knows what he's doing. Although these rapes are impulsive, there's still an element of planning, of trying to avoid detection.
Police didn't have to look far to find the sexual predator responsible for the recent assaults. By mid-1980, The 26-year-old was back behind bars, serving a 6-year sentence.
Sex offenders, I think, are just about non-rehabilitable. It's the most difficult thing to get a person to rehabilitate in this. They often have no insight, no acceptance of responsibility for it.
He obviously wanted to continue committing crimes, and I guess at the end it seemed like the natural progression of that hatred was to commit the ultimate crime.
It was February 1985. 31-year-old Dupas had served 5 years and was 2 weeks away from being officially released. He was out of prison on a week of pre-release leave when a woman was found beaten to death.
The body of Helen McMahon was discovered in sand dunes 500 metres from the Dundas Street car park. A post-mortem this morning revealed that she died as a result of massive head injuries.
The woman was last seen alive here at the Rye Shopping Centre at about 12 o'clock yesterday. However, her movements after then and before the discovery of her body are still a mystery, and police are appealing to the public for assistance.
It was a number of years before investigators discovered Dupas was on pre-release leave and living in the Rye area at the time of the murder. Although never charged, police believed Dupas to be the killer.
I'm quite sure that his name would have crossed the lips of a number of homicide detectives in dealing with unsolved murders against women.
Just 4 days after his official release in early 1985, Dupas headed straight to a beach near the scene of Helen McMahon's murder. There, he stalked, then raped a 21-year-old woman. He was back behind bars just before his 32nd birthday, having been convicted of rape for the 3rd time.
You have to understand that the system over the years has really tried to help Peter. There were any number of professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, psychotherapists. He was part of a sex offenders group in Pentridge. And he would exasperate their psychotherapist, where he would pretend to be interested, only to later to find out that he was just pretending, literally just doing that.
Psychopaths are evasive and cunning. They're experts at telling therapists what they think they want to hear and of twisting what they learn in therapy to further their own ends. People like Dupas would simply use therapy to work out how to fake better and learn what might hurt someone else the most. It's rare for his mask to slip. The monster within is reserved only for those at the other end of his knife.
Jail contained and repressed the monster within, and there seemed only one way out for Dupas's extreme frustration. In Pentridge's psychiatric G division, he attempted suicide twice. But soon, the possibility of escape presented itself. Her name was Claire.
Peter was working in the laundry part of Pentridge at that time, G division, and he let himself go really badly. And I had to talk to him and asked him why he was reacting, he was acting like this, and it was very obvious from our conversation that he was deeply depressed.
Claire was a psychiatric nurse and 16 years older than Dupas. She thought she could turn his life around.
He would talk to me about everyday things, or how he was feeling, physically, or if he'd been having bad dreams or nightmares or whatever.
Claire took Dupas under her wing, and sensing a golden opportunity, he made an extraordinary proposal to her. Was Peter Dupas finally putting an end to his evil ways? Or was he just drawing Claire into his manipulative games? In 1985, 32-year-old Peter Dupas was serving 12 years for his 3rd rape conviction. In Pentridge Jail, he met Claire, a kindly nurse 16 years his senior. Sensing an opportunity, he formed an attachment to her, eventually proposing marriage.
He always worried that, he was going to be 40 and there was be no one waiting for him at the gate.
Claire accepted Dupas's proposal. And in August 1987, when Dupas was 34, the pair married in Castlemaine Prison.
I felt I had an obligation to see him through, at least through his time in prison, and then always hoping that when he was released, that you know, we'd see the other side of him, that he would become more masculine and take more responsibility. But that didn't happen.
It would be almost 5 years before they would live together as husband and wife. The couple eventually set up house on his release in March 1992, in the quiet Macedon Ranges north of Melbourne. Although consummated, this was never going to be a normal marriage. Dupas was 39 years old and about to live with a woman for the first time since leaving his mother's side.
It was a mother-son relationship. There was really no intimacy, and in some ways this is something I'm very thankful for, that I didn't have to put up with, you know, being molested in bed or whatever. He was very possessive of me, yes. He didn't like, say if any of my family did come, he had to be right there, like listening to every word, and not that we wouldn't be talking about him, but, you know, he had to be the number one.
After 20 months of living together, Claire believed her husband was reformed. She wasn't even suspicious when a woman was stabbed to death in nearby Sunbury.
A neighbouring shopkeeper found Renita Brunton's body in the rear of her recycle fashion shop around 5 o'clock yesterday afternoon. The murder has unsettled the small community.
I would plead to the person perhaps who has done this to think about what they've done. And you need help.
Years later, a task force would be established to investigate links between Dupas and unsolved murders, particularly those involving women who had been stabbed. Police now believe Renita Brunton was Dupas's second murder victim. It was Christmas 1993, 2 months after Renita's murder. Claire had to work overnight at the local nursing home. Dupas became inconsolable. He panicked, insisting he join her.
He was just sort of standing between me and the door, and I said, look, I said, will you just please get out, just get out from under my feet. I said, just go and do something, anything, but get out from under my feet, you're driving me crazy. And we came home that night, and then he went down to the shed, and he had prepared everything in the shed to say he was going fishing, and he showed me where these things, and he told me he was going to Trentham.
Dupas packed the car with everything he needed to commit a murder. Knives, a balaclava, a plastic sheet, and a shovel. The next morning he left home, his pockets stuffed with handcuffs, masking tape and condoms. But instead of going fishing at Trentham, he headed to nearby Lake Epilock.
So he had made up his mind the night before that what he was going to do.
Dupas entered the toilet block of the local caravan park. He forced his way into a cubicle and held a young woman captive. She managed to fight him off, and Dupas fled the scene with the woman's friends in pursuit. His car lost control and he was arrested.
I just can't tell you how bad I felt. It was just the worst feeling. You know, I just couldn't stop crying. I cried for 2 days. I couldn't get myself together at all.
Claire filed for divorce. She never saw her husband again.
How do men like Dupas manage to find a partner when they've already been convicted of such terrible crimes? Well, Dupas learned early that presenting as a helpless, naive boy would attract certain people to him, namely women who want to mother him. These women become tangled in a rescue fantasy, believing that they could be the one person to fix him. If they gave him enough love and guidance, he'd be cured. Fortunately for Claire, this was not a fatal mistake, as it has been for others who've married serial killers.
Despite his history and all the evidence, Dupas was only charged with false imprisonment for the Lake Epilock attack. He was sentenced to just 3 years and 9 months. Dupas was now 41 years old. He had been in jail for 17 of his last 20 years. Having gotten away with murder twice, he would soon be looking for his next victim. By September 1996, 43-year-old Peter Dupas had finished his 4th jail sentence. He'd spent 20 years in jail for sexual offences. Each time he'd been released from prison, Dupas had moved to a different area of Melbourne where no one knew of his past. Then the attacks against women would begin again. Dupas created a web of terror, and still he got away with it.
Look, it embarrassed his family no end. You know, the parents actually moved interstate, and his father basically died before his time. No doubt the stress of the whole thing.
Within a few months, he was living in Melbourne's northern suburbs. He found work in a Salvation Army joinery workshop for former prisoners.
I first met Peter in about 1996, I think it was. My husband at the time was working where Peter had been released from jail, and they were working together, and Peter and my husband struck up a friendship, and yeah.
It was the first time I thought he had truly perhaps made an attempt at changing his life. He was more sure of himself, and then there was a reduction in anxiety. So that made me think that perhaps, you know, there's a process of maturation has taken place, and let's give him a chance.
Oh yeah, he had everyone fooled. It was just, he was just so nice. He was polite, he was nice. Everybody thought he was lovely.
Dupas successfully hid the truth about his violent past from his new circle of friends. He even found another girlfriend who typically took on the mother role in his life.
She was very domineering and demanding, and he did whatever she said.
Dupas's live-in girlfriend left for a long overseas holiday in September 1997. He became unhinged and obsessively called a succession of escort agencies, massage parlours and phone sex services. Then he prepared himself for a frenzy of violent crime, worse than anything that had come before.
Prostitute Margaret Marr was found dumped off the Hume Highway at Somerton in October 1997, just hours after she was seen in a Broadmeadows supermarket.
Dupas's victim worked as a prostitute just one street away from Dupas's house.
The 40-year-old was under a cardboard sheet, her clothing partially removed. The body had been mutilated, the left breast had been completely severed.
The mutilations would become a vital clue to solving this murder. Police began piecing together a pattern of attack, helping them identify characteristics of the vicious killer.
Killers like Dupas leave their psychological fingerprints at the scene. This is their signature behaviour, something a killer does to satisfy his emotional needs. For Dupas, this was the slashing of the victim's breasts and thighs, whether they were alive or dead.
Peter Dupas was still on the hunt. For several weeks, he'd been stalking women in Melbourne's vast Fawkner Cemetery, in an area near his grandfather's grave. Then, on the afternoon of All Saints' Day, November 1st, he went into the cemetery with murder on his mind.
25-year-old bank officer Mersina Halvargas was reported missing at 2 this morning when she didn't come home from the cemetery. Police made the grim discovery soon after.
The victim's body was found face up between the headstones, only metres from her grandmother's grave.
Mersina Halvargas had been paying her respects at her grandmother's grave when Dupas attacked and stabbed her violently in the chest. The horror of Mersina's murder shook Melbourne, and women feared for their lives. No one could imagine anything worse. But Dupas's next move would be beyond comprehension.
Detectives door-knocking the quiet neighbourhood in a bid to solve the puzzle behind the brutal murder of the nursing home's leading light, Kathleen Downs. The 95-year-old's body was found in the room she'd lived in for 8 years.
Police traced phone calls from Dupas to the nursing home where the bubbly grandmother, Kathleen Downs, lived. The callous murder of Mrs. Downs remains unsolved, but police believe Dupas is responsible. The sickening pattern of Dupas's crimes was slowly emerging, but sadly, it would take the life of another young woman to finally bring the killer undone. The city of Melbourne was gripped by terror with reports of stalking, rape, and ultimately 3 horrific yet unsolved murders. Women feared for their safety. Over a period of 3 months beginning in October 1997, Peter Dupas is believed to have murdered 3 women in the city of Melbourne.
The 40-year-old was under a cardboard sheet, her clothing partially removed. The body had
Messina Halvargas was killed at Faulkner Cemetery in November 1997. The 25-year-old...
Mrs Downs was lying in a pool of blood next to the bed in her single room at the front of the Brunswick Special Accommodation Home.
No one knew where the killer would strike next.
It's very scared. Very, very, very scared.
Dupas targeted psychotherapist Nikki Patterson through a professional ad placed in the local newspaper. He booked a session with her for the Monday morning of April the 19th, 1999.
Nikki was just a lovely, fun-loving, very intelligent child. She was very passionate and compassionate. I believe Dupas was probably Nikki's first client from the advertisement, and she had never met him before. He wasn't known to her. She'd had probably a couple of phone conversations. He'd rung her house probably 16 times, and it was more stalking to ascertain whether she was home alone, when she was home, and when it was safe for him to have an appointment with her, because he only had one idea in his head.
That day, Dupas left home at 8 in the morning. He arrived at Nikki's and she ushered him into the front room, leaving her dog Bella outside. Dupas was scared of dogs, and this would prove a fateful move.
Nikki was professional. She would never have the dog in the house, of course, when she was seeing a client.
When she returned with 2 cups of coffee, Dupas attacked her. He stabbed her in the chest and back 27 times. Then he cut off her breasts.
He used a false name and he used a false number. Those details were in a diary of Nikki's, and Dupas, even though he did go through the house, he missed them. So he did his best to disguise the crime, but not enough. On the Thursday night, it was 3 days after Nikki was found, the detective rang me and said, we have made an arrest. The name is Peter Dupas. He has a history, he's a serial rapist. And then he rang back 6 hours later to say that he'd been charged.
Nicole Patterson's calculated murder shows the depth of Dupas's inner fury. He stabbed her 27 times. Such a frenzied attack is known as overkill, creating far more injuries than are needed to cause death. Overkill is the result of cumulative rage, extreme anger and frustration that Dupas kept hidden until he had his victims alone and helpless.
Pain and loss showed on the faces of those who were there to remember their friend Nikki Patterson, who'd been taken away from them so suddenly.
The dog that she owned when she died went to her funeral.
Bella was her baby, and I recall, whenever I was over there.
When Nikki's name was mentioned, Bella would bark, and when they took Nikki away, Bella howled.
On August 15th, 2000, Peter Dupas was sentenced to life imprisonment for Nicole Patterson's murder. Incredibly, he would appeal his sentence several times.
When you saw Dupas at the trial, I don't believe I would have looked twice at him in the street.
I looked at this person the first time and I thought, no, you couldn't have done it.
You could never look Dupas in the eye. He would come out from the door into the courtroom and he would never make eye contact with anyone.
Keeping a close eye on Nicole Patterson's trial was the family of Messina Halvargas. Messina's parents had long suspected that Dupas had killed their daughter. In 2001, Victorian police set up Task Force Mikado to investigate Dupas over several unsolved murders. In October 2002, he was charged with the murder of prostitute Margaret Marr.
Experts found only one other case involving a similar mutilation. The jury heard the victim was psychotherapist Nicole Patterson, who was stabbed to death in her Northcote home. The person who mutilated her is the same person who mutilated Margaret Marr, that is Peter Dupas, the prosecution claims. Dupas has pleaded not guilty.
On August 11th, 2004, Peter Dupas was sentenced to a second life term for the murder of Margaret Marr. Meanwhile, the family of Messina Helvargas still waited for justice.
I don't think he has the capacity to fully own up to such a crime, because to really take full responsibility for it, you have to conclude to yourself, it's your monster.
This man, who never confessed his shocking crimes to police, was to do so to an unlikely character he met in prison, a fellow inmate and disbarred lawyer.
Andrew Fraser says Peter Dupas confessed numerous times to killing Messina Helvargas at Faulkner Cemetery 10 years ago.
Andrew Fraser's testimony sealed the killer's fate. The public outrage over the murder of Messina Helvargas was intense. In an unusual move, the judge allowed a camera into his courtroom when he sentenced Dupas in August 2007.
For the murder of Messina Helvargas, I sentence you to life imprisonment. I refuse to set any minimum term. Life means life. Remove the prisoner.
A 10-year crusade by a grieving family vindicated in one word, guilty.
I always believe that I'll come to these.
Peter Dupas will never get out of jail. He's been convicted of 3 murders, but police believe he's committed at least 6.
I don't believe there was ever a chance of rehabilitation for Peter Dupas. I believe he was born the way he is, as a psychopath.
It's very unfortunate to say that a person doesn't or shouldn't deserve to be on this earth, but I guess he'd be one that I'd have to say would fit that category.
The case of Peter Dupas raises many important and frightening questions. Firstly, can a child be born evil? I don't believe so, but there is evidence that children can be born with a reduced ability to empathise with others and increased capacity for violence. So when we identify those characteristics in a child, what can be done? Well, therapy with young children who are showing signs of disturbed behaviour is critical, because if these problems aren't addressed early, there's little we can do. There's virtually no evidence at the present time that we can cure an adult psychopath. And in the case of Peter Dupas, there's one question we can answer. If we let him out, will he kill again? The answer is yes.